We play Dungeons and Dragons! Or is that trademarked? I wonder if that's trademarked.
Start the game already!
That's 2 episodes in a row you've done that.
I'm hoping that people will get annoyed enough by it that they'll send me booze that doesn't have a cork in
it. That's what we need. Not a Patreon, but like just booze.
Well, we
beer patrons.
What we desperately need is to be sponsored by some kind of alcoholic beverage company.
Maybe I should set up like a PO box for us. Just say send stuff, anything. It really doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, whatever you want. I mean, send us an old tire full of bricks. Like, we don't care.
As long as you're paying shipping on it.
Yeah.
Well, this is going to shock you, but I'm not actually drinking cider.
What?
Well, it is after Labor Day, which means it's pumpkin season, apparently. Pumpkin everything.
It is.
And I went shopping and I found Big Rig Brewery Tales from the Patch Pumpkin Porter.
Oh, okay.
Apparently the can glows in the dark.
Oh, that'll play well on the actual audio only podcast.
Yeah.
Hey, wow, that really does glow.
Yeah. Oh my God.
We have a big rig in Ottawa, just down the road.
Yeah.
Yep, they actually brew stuff on site. Yeah, I have a big rig glass actually in the cupboard upstairs because the last time we were there, the only time we were there.
Not a lot of pumpkin. It's subtle, so it's not overwhelming. It's not bad.
Oh, there you go. I'm boring this week. I'm drinking vodka again. I made some lemonade to mix with it. I'm hoping to get through it soon.
The thing that you hate, you punish yourself.
I spent money on it. I have to use it. I'm thrifty.
Said you can, surely you've need to do some post-processing on some 3D prints or something.
I do have some cat barf on the carpet that I could clean up.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? That leads into a sort of a segue for an idea that I just remembered that I had, that I want to actually start printing off some dungeon tiles, because I'm hoping to start an in-person game at some point in the nebulous future. Mm-hmm. And I would like to have tiles where I could go, and then you come into this room, click.
Oh, nice. So actual full tiles, not just scatter terrain to throw on a map.
Yeah. Yeah, actual for the in-dungeon stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Where it actually clicks together with magnets or something.
Very nice. You got into that a bit before, didn't you?
I did, and then COVID hit, and suddenly it was like, well, none of us are ever going to meet in person again, so this doesn't matter. Shut that off.
So you managed to put a headset on today?
I did. Yesterday was a little bit awkward. I actually had to go upstairs and steal my wife's Bluetooth speaker so I could continue playing Baldur's Gate 3. Oh, yeah. Surprise, surprise. I'm still playing Baldur's Gate 3.
Okay.
Also, here's a giant surprise.
You started it again, obviously.
I did start again.
I'm at the point, got 60 hours in and you still haven't made it past the Little Grove thing?
I don't know. Does it record per playthrough or does it record total? Because I had 32 hours into the previous playthrough and I was about 80 or 90% of the way through the Underdark, having finished everything else in what I assume is Act 1, right? Like before you click through into the mountain pass. And I got to the point where I wasn't really feeling it. I'm playing through as the goody two shoes route, which is, the one that just feels most natural to me. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm playing as a paladin. Why don't I actually just play as a paladin? So
are you at the point where you don't have withers yet in your camp?
Yeah, I do.
So why start over again instead of just respecing?
I also wanted to change my race. So I'm playing through as a drow paladin.
That's an interesting combo.
Yeah, it is. It's actually kind of neat. There's not a lot of the oh my god a drow, but there are a few instances of that. There's quite a few sort of it's odd to see one of your people here. That's pretty much it. But
Well, we'll have to talk about Baldur's Gate 3 some more, maybe next show. I promised we'd try and get through an episode without, you know, being a Baldur's Gate 3 podcast.
it's not gonna. We just got to rename the podcast to Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, that's what I basically said in the last episode. I think I named it. I guess we're a Baldur's Gate 3 podcast now.
Yeah,
Sorry,
we did.
everyone.
We did talk about it a lot.
So I had a depressing thing happen this week, and it's particularly relevant to this show for a couple of reasons. I think it was a couple weeks ago. We had this conversation about celebrity and don't meet your heroes,
Yep.
and I got a bit of a gut punch this weekend. I just happened to be doing some googling and some quick research, and probably the one of the people most responsible for shaping me as a nerd and some of my general nerd interests. Turns out they were a terrible human being, and nobody knew. So, for details, because we've been talking about fantasy literature and we've been reading the Patrick Rothfuss stuff, and my benchmark for fantasy, because it's really was my gateway into the genre, was
Mm-hmm.
some of the stuff I read when I was younger, and I'm a big fan of the books of David Eddings.
Yeah.
We've talked about some of his stuff, and I've used it as a point of comparison before. And until this weekend, I would have said, you know what? As an adult, I can see that his fantasy was a little formulaic and rudimentary. It's sort of the last gasp of the old school.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell that a lot of it was very much
It's like Tolkien
and
fanfic.
yeah, but that sort of hey, I need to make this is a paycheck to me kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I can see those flaws in the writing now. But
Mm.
with my nostalgia goggles, I still look back at the books fondly. And I was actually considering recommending that you as somebody who I don't think has read his stuff before,
Some of it. I've read some of it.
I was going to recommend we read the Elenium and Tamuli series. They're shorter, sort of 2-3 book series. So it would have been 6 books in total. Just sort of pick away at them. And I was just doing some Googling related to that. And then I found some stories about Mr. Eddings. Stuff that his wife died in 2007, I think. And then he passed away in 2009.
Mm.
And I want to say only like 2020, maybe 2019 ish. Some details really made it into mainstream media about some shit that went on before he was even writing books. Um, Child abuse, and I don't want to undersell this as just like stereotypical kind of blue collar everyday child abuse. Like I'm talking adopting children and putting them in cages kind of child abuse.
Oh man.
And I started reading some things. I went down a bit of a Reddit rabbit hole, and it's like, okay, well, this is allegations, allegedly. Then there's links to some old articles from newspapers talking about Eddings and his wife spending a year in jail over this, and the two adopted children were taken away. And
Oh
then
man.
there's the typical fanboy sort of reaction where anybody that's going to defend anybody for any reason, they're like, well, that's using a middle name. That's not his middle name, is it? Well, actually, yeah. Well, that's not his wife's name. No, well, actually, after they moved because of this, his wife changed her name.
Mm.
So, my understanding, having done a little bit of research, is that it is very much was him. And man, that sucks. You
It
know?
Yeah, it does. I like to think and hope that people can change, right? And this gets into a sort of deeper and more serious subject of like what do we do with people when they break whatever the boundaries and rules that we set up as a society?
Hmm.
Because I mean, you can throw him in jail, and yeah, you should. Yes, he needs to be punished. Sure, sure.
Hmm.
But
Like
what?
reform and rehabilitation is important. I'm a big believer
Agreed.
in that,
Yes.
and that people need to earn the opportunity to be better people. But
Right.
that doesn't mean forgetting and forgiving
No.
the things that they've done.
No, but if you're going to give somebody an opportunity to change and become a better person, then there has to be the opportunity for
You have to,
forgiveness.
yeah, you have to make room for them in society.
Yeah.
But where I'm at now, like I look, there was no, while both of them were alive, as far as I can tell, there was no forthcoming apology. There was no even like openly talking about, I did some things in my past. Like it
Oh,
was
yeah.
just like, we're going to move to a different state in a different part of the country. We're never going to talk about this. I can't get a normal job anymore, so I'm going to write some books.
Why
It's
wouldn't
up
you
in
do
the
it
air.
under a pseudonym though? Like if you were trying really hard to escape.
I don't know.
It's
I
before the
mean,
internet,
it's
so
before the internet, and honestly, it was a time when a lot of people probably wouldn't have cared. The publisher saw
yeah.
the books. It was in the very, very early days of fantasy being viable, like money-making literature.
Hmm.
And I think Del Rey was the publisher. Lester Del Rey,
Yeah.
like personally saw the books, and I mean they've got a history of hitching their wagon to not some not great people. So looking back on it, I'm not terribly surprised, but it's like having my childhood ruined almost. Like it was
Yeah.
such an important part of shaping who I was. I've got friends, not like everyday friends, but like online friends that I still talk to once in a while that I met in like David Eddings fan community sites like GeoCities and like early Yahoo board stuff. And I mean the books are prominent. They're the only books that I go back and read every, I don't know, half decade or so. Like, I've reread a lot of my fantasy stuff, but I've
Hmm.
probably read the Belgariad Malorian series 8 times at this point in my life. Some of the other series, 4 or 5 times. Like, and now knowing what I know, like I go back and I think about things in the books, stuff that didn't stand out to me as being a problem, and now
But now
they're
too.
colored a little bit differently.
Hmm.
Some of the ways children are portrayed, some of the ways women are portrayed. Um,
It's a little bit of a power fantasy going on.
I I really I don't know. Like I would have held up his work as one of the earlier, like obviously his portrayal of women isn't great, but relative to his peers at the time that his books were big, I would have said here's one of the better examples.
Hmm.
It's not perfect, but it's several steps in the right direction. It was not like it had moved away from the kind of stuff that appealed to people like that were into Conan and the sort of
Yeah.
very like uber masculine kind of, like it was light sword and sorcery. It was closer to Harry Potter without
Yeah.
being for, you know,
For
explicitly for children.
yeah. It was almost young adult, but not quite. Yeah, I remember various
Yeah.
bits of it. Speaking of, sorry, this is a little bit of a. But you mentioned Conan, and I think I may have mentioned. I know I mentioned it to you before, but I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the podcast before. I went and actually bought the collected works of the Conan guy. What's his name? Oh my god. Don't even have alcohol as an excuse. It's not important. Robert E. Howard. Is that him? And I started reading some of
Yeah,
it. And
Robert
I'm
D. Howard.
like, yeah, and it's bad. Like it's really, really bad. I mean, it's very much a work of its time. But even for its time, I'm pretty sure it
And
was.
there's a line in a lot of that early fantasy, like, you know, I would look at something like Tolkien and say it was of its time.
Yep.
There's very, very, even if he didn't mean them in a negative way, like um, Tolkien, fought in World War One. He had a lot of good things to say about Jewish people, for instance,
Hmm.
but still referred to them almost as if they were different people. And then you
Yeah.
see, the influences of that in his portrayals of dwarven culture and stuff, and it's just like, ooh, of
Yeah.
its
It's
time, not it. It isn't a slap you in the face offensive as a lot of other
yeah.
stuff was at the time, but it's still there. You can see it. Like, maybe 20
It's
years you wouldn't have seen it, but you do now.
yeah. I mean, it's there. It exists. I think it's easy enough if you want to pretend it's not there that you can probably skip over it mentally.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, one of the things about Tolkien actually that springs to mind is that like he had like women as characters in his fiction that stood on their own.
Hmm.
Not a lot of them, mind you, but some anyway.
Hmm.
So that was pretty cool, I think.
Yeah. And, I would have thought that, like, looking back at the David Eddings stuff, like, you know, I considered it a positive step in the genre. And now this weekend, I've been doing a little bit of soul searching and just trying to remember some of the things that I've read. And it just, it it paints things with a little bit of a different brush. Like, I don't know that it outright paints it, but that's an
Pers-
interesting sort of
Perspective
exercise to think
matters.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, and once you like, for example, like I mean, as kids, right? We watched Top Gun, and then we saw Tom Cruise jumping on Oprah's couch, and now can't watch a Tom Cruise movie without thinking this guy's kind of a weirdo.
Yeah, I think most people have embraced him as the weirdo now.
I mean, his
But
his movies are fun to watch. I don't,
yeah.
but he's like it crosses my mind, and then I'm like, okay, that's just a movie. It's just entertainment. Right. And that's one of the things too. I mean, that's a big question. Can you separate the art from the artist? Because if we go back like to the 60s and 70s, pretty much everybody who was involved in everything everywhere was pretty much like a horrible misogynist racist prick.
Hmm. And okay. David Eddings is not important in the grand scheme of literature. Like, sometimes you
No.
look back at authors that have obviously not aged well, but you recognize them as being sort of culturally significant, both of their time and of the time that followed, the time that they helped shape and mold. David Eddings isn't that. He was a hack fantasy writer that just happened to resonate specifically with me at the time
Hmm.
that I read him. And I wasn't the only one. Like, actually, one of my English teachers, my high school, recommended David Eddings to me. Like, not as a, hey, read this for class, but hey, let me lend you my books. I think you'll
Oh,
really dig them.
oh, that's cool.
And that was my introduction. Oh, I just don't know. Like, should it taint my perception of these books? Should I allow it to? Like, is it the right thing to do to now consume this art through the lens of the things that I know about the artist?
It might be worth taking a re-look at it, but again, like it comes down to do we consume the artist or do we consume the art? And I don't know the answer to the question. I mean, it's a valid question. I think it's worthy of discussion. Um, it's not like you're sending money to a horrible person at
No,
this point.
you know, at this point, like you know, the estate, like I don't I don't even know who has the estate. Like they're dead. They're not getting money.
Hmm.
So by even
You already
recommending that
own the
you,
books.
yeah, oh, I already own the books, but even recommending them to others, like not I'm no longer rewarding somebody for a shady life that they managed to keep under wraps long enough to achieve success. Like, you know, still a New York Times bestseller multi times over, you know.
Well, I don't know. I again, it comes down to the question of like who gets to judge, right? Like, is it? And again, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that question. Um, I would suggest sometimes that judgment needs to it sort of needs to sit in the hands of a collective because any individual given the power to judge. I mean, I've read the internet. Have you read the internet? If we let any one of those morons, and I include myself in that number, be in charge of anything, we're in trouble, right? Like we need to. This brings up yet another thing that I would like to talk about at some point. I would like to talk about internet trolls at some point. Um, Probably not tonight because I need to put my thoughts in order. But the idea that we need argument in the classical sense. We need people who disagree with each other in order to form proper conclusions. And so in order to find the truth, we need to have not necessarily opposing, but very definitely different points of view. Because I despise business literature and business advice, but there is some that is applicable all over the place. And the one thing that has stuck with me, and I think I read this in my early 20s, so this was, I don't know, back in the dark ages before electricity, was I don't need you to agree with me all the time. If you and I agree all the time, one of us is unnecessary.
Hmm.
So it's nice to have opposing viewpoints, and I sort of occupy an interesting space in opinions, in that I can sort of see both sides of this argument. Like on the one hand, like if you enjoy the books, you enjoy the books, right? The books are not the man.
Hmm.
On the other hand, do you want to recommend them to people anymore? Maybe not. But I don't think that you should feel guilty about enjoying the works that the man created.
No, I don't. I just and listen, it isn't my job to thoroughly research and if necessarily write like a detailed biography of every artist I'm interested in you know enjoying their art before I enjoy it, right? Like,
Ain't nobody got time for that.
but at the same time, like I feel like as somebody who has enjoyed him as much as I have and actively been a part of communities around this guy, like it isn't just that I read the books and liked them, you know.
Hmm.
Like I let the books define a lot of my nerddom. I recommended them to other people. I I do think I need to just explicitly apologize. I've mentioned him a few times on this show before. If anybody out there listened and recognized the name and heard me praising or speaking positively about this man, uh, sincerely, I'm sorry. I did not know. At the time that I said those things, I did not know. Um, I know now. And while it maybe isn't my responsibility to be in the know, I just want to make sure that you know that I wasn't turning a blind eye to these things intentionally while talking about this guy and praising his works. Um, it was a shock to me this weekend, and it really sucks. You know,
Yeah.
never meet your heroes, man.
Yeah, it's they're not
And
heroes.
I mean, that just sort of feeds into the idea that it would have been better to be ignorant and not know this thing and continue to be sort of blind to it. So maybe you have to meet your heroes, but in meeting your heroes, keep your expectations low.
Let's all go meet Keanu Reeves.
Yes. Help me, Keanu Reeves. You're my only hope. If you happen to be interested in writing a really great fantasy series, I will be the first one to buy your books.
I mean, he's acted in a really great fantasy series. It's called John Wick, and they're amazing. I mean, the story is deep and nuanced. Let me give you a plot synopsis. They kill his dog, and he goes ape shit.
What more do you need in a fantasy
Uh,
series
That's
and or anything really?
it's pretty much all you need.
I mean, I could have done without the dog killing, but it
Yeah.
works for what it is.
I mean, if you want to, reduce Tolkien down to that, it's like, hey, here's this ring. It's a problem. Let's go for a walk. uh,
All right, so enough of the depressing shit. I did have some stuff I wanted to talk to you about today. I want to actually pick your brain, drill
uh-oh.
into that noggin of yours, and suck out the juice.
Are you an illithid now? Have you
I'm
gone
not
through
an illithid.
Ceramorphosis?
I
No,
just I just play one on TV.
haven't gone through Ceramorphosis yet. It is to be avoided. Sorry.
So, at least until this David Edding shit popped up, I've been spending a little bit more mental energy on um, my prototype tabletop role playing system. Just trying to get organized. I haven't spent a lot of time developing it per se. Like I've sort of hit this point where I'm ready to take the next step, but I want to start defining some things before I jump.
Mm-hmm.
I think going into a project like this, it's one thing to set some initial goals, but I'm now at the stage where I want to set some like guiding principles, something that I can constantly refer back to as I'm making decisions. And
Don't be
I,
evil.
yeah, don't be evil. Um, but I also like to overcomplicate things.
Oh, yes, you do.
You think? So I guess that's the initial thing. How do you say no to your own ideas that don't fit, even if you think they're really good ideas?
um, well, I mean, I learned that lesson at work. Um, Thankfully, in a non-destructive manner. It's actually, and the way it came to me is a coworker more or less like reiterating the idea that you can't be married to your ideas. If you come up with an idea, and whoever, now it's a little bit different when you're working on the thing yourself and you're arguing with yourself, but for me it was like if whoever's in charge of the thing says, hey, it's a good idea, but no, like we're already doing it this way, you have to put your ego aside. And really, I think it comes down to ego. Like if you have a good idea and it doesn't fit, you have to put your ego aside and look at it coldly and logically and say, does it make sense to try and incorporate this, or does this belong somewhere else? Like, is it a good idea that I can use elsewhere, or that I can, I don't know, give away, or
Mhm.
whatever.
So,
um,
for some context, the genesis of the idea of this system, and I'm going to call it a framework rather than a system, and I'll get into some of those details. But when I took the leap of faith to start creating something, my goal was to create a simple tabletop system, not necessarily rules light, not necessarily like no rules, but I wanted something that adapted well to different settings, different types of gameplay. You do your typical sword and sorcery stuff. You could be rats running around a maze. You wanted to get into some space hijinks. Uh, this has some basic mechanics that you can lean on to spin up something quickly.
Hmm.
Now, my goal wasn't to turn it into a like replacement for something like D&D 5th edition.
Or
You know,
GURPS.
like D&D 5th edition for long campaigns, especially if you're playing in a setting that is appropriate for D&D 5th edition. It's great. It's not perfect, but it's achieved the success that it has for reasons. It isn't just a brand name because D&D 4th edition was a brand name and it did not gain the kind of traction that 5th edition did for lots of reasons.
We should talk about that in another episode.
We should. So this goes back to our game when you kicked off the hub idea.
Hmm.
Not only would you have a hub where our characters could kind of leap into different sort of settings and themes and stuff, but you also wanted to provide an opportunity for different people in our group to actually GM some of those adventures.
Hmm.
And the first thing I wanted to do was make some sort of adaptation to do some Mass Effect stuff because it's a setting that I really want to explore. There is a fan made 5th edition sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, 5th edition plus 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 or Mass Effect. And it's,
Conversion matrices.
yeah, and it's just like, it's all the baggage of D&D plus all the baggage of a bunch of shit piled on top of it. And I got thinking as I was looking at exploring these things, like if we're going to just, hey, let's spend 3 weeks or 4 weeks doing this, and then let's jump into something else, to have to go through the learning curve of new systems each and every time you wanted to do something small. There are systems out there that, like, I could have found something that was canned and ready to go, but I took it upon myself to want to build something. So that was the problem I was trying to solve. So the idea is to, be complex enough to be engaging, provide enough tools to uh, adjudicate exploration, combat, and social encounters. And what's a little bit different about it is I wanted to package it up as a something that somebody else could use to as a starting point to adapt their own material. So
Hmm.
where this would be different than like a 5th edition SRD, where there's some base mechanics here, there's some base classes, there's some base abilities. Like the abilities and the items and some of that stuff would be pulled away from the system and attached to the setting, because that stuff should all be flavored and shaped and molded around the unique things about your setting.
Hmm.
So what I wanted to do is provide a mechanical framework to, okay, hey, you want to do some crazy magic, you want to do some samurai shit, you want to do laser swords and Star Warsy type stuff. Here's some of the underlying mechanics. Uh, Here's how you can kind of quasi balance that stuff. Roll dice,
Hmm.
and then you flavor it how you'd like. Use that as kind of the starting point for adapting whatever material it is that you want. Um, so obviously, the framework would have to sort of look at the core mechanics of that kind of things. Like these are the types of things that you would need to take into consideration when designing weapons. Um, Here's how the things that these items do would interact with the rest of the systems, but I wouldn't. No, let me rephrase because I don't want to say wouldn't. If I were to release this as a product, and I'm considering it, I would release a free version that was the full sword and sorcery version of this
Hmm.
for free, open license. But if I wanted to then look at it as a way of like a side hustle, then I could put creative energy into creating settings
Yep.
and some of the stuff that should be attached to that setting. So items and abilities and things appropriate to that setting that can then be sort of retrofit into the system. That was kind of my approach, but again, keep it simple. That was the whole goal. And every time I think about this bloody thing, I start going off into like crazy places. Like you and I, the last time we talked about these systems, talked about like progression of abilities and spell progression. And I was sitting in the shower yesterday, I think, thinking about this, and I'm like, oh, here's a neat system for like leveling up spells. And I started like developing this whole mastery or expertise system where you could learn, like, say, a level one spell. Say it's like a fireball or no firebolt ish spell, right?
Okay. Yep.
And you can invest points into it as you learn these expertise points to do different things depending on the nature of the ability. Like, uh, let's go to fireball as a middle range ability. I can increase the damage of that spell. I can increase the area of effect of that spell. I can cause an effect over time if I wanted. Sort of a neat way of taking what would be a simple spell and allowing you to tailor it to the particular style you want to play through investing these mastery or expertise points.
Hmm.
Started writing some notes. This is really good. This is gold, Jerry. And I'm like, but I wanted to keep this shit simple. This isn't simple.
Hmm. Yeah, it's tough to keep things simple. I would like to go back to an earlier point, the idea of investing creative energy into settings and things like that. I think whatever system that it is, like whatever the mechanic is, because there really should be one of the things that 5e did, and it did really really well, is that there's basically one mechanic.
Mhm.
There's one roll d20 and beat a number.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that they nailed making that good, but it is simple, right? And there's a
Mhm.
central mechanic. Um, but really, what makes any of that work? Because I mean, anybody can say like, "Hey, roll a d6 and you have to beat a 5."
Mhm.
What makes that work is like, well, where are we going? What does it look like? Who are the people that are there?
Mhm.
How do they act? What are they interested in? Like, hey, I go into a shop. What's there? All of that stuff is actually the stuff that matters. Like you could, and I've participated in things where there are no dice.
Mhm.
There's a referee, right? And it's literally like you describe what you're doing, and someone says either it works or it doesn't,
Mhm.
and that works. The important part is sort of like what exists around that central mechanic.
Mhm.
So I would say that it's probably best to start with like make a simple mechanic. Don't even worry about what's attached to it,
Yeah,
and
no,
then
and I'm there, sort of minus the playtesting and turning knobs. Like I've got a fairly fleshed out
mhm,
um competing roles based system that seems to touch on most of what I want to touch on. Sort of speeds up the pace of a lot of play. Sort of a simplified action system. Rolling dice is fun. I thought about like a diceless system that was more of a referee style thing, and it wasn't quite what I was going for a couple reasons. One, again, I wanted something that could be like, I'm a DM, maybe I'm a new DM, or maybe I'm not, but I'm jumping into doing some new material, and this is a small investment of time.
mhm,
Or if I'm passionate about adapting a particular thing, maybe a bigger investment of time on part of the DM, but burdening them with the extra responsibility of being God. Like, we
yeah,
always think of DMs as being God, right? But God that's still at the mercy of the dice rolls in most systems
yep,
versus, the be all end all of adjudicating every decision without chance, without luck.
mhm.
And that's an interesting thing. And I did consider it, but I opted to go in a different direction for my system. Um, as I say, I overcomplicate everything, and I always get to a point where it's like, okay, you're putting too much thought into this, Shane. Can you turn it into a side hustle? Is it worth turning into a side hustle? Are you serious enough about this to ever get to a point where it's a viable anything? That doesn't, whether it's a game system, whether it's you know, my little side art project, whether it's fucking hot dog restaurant, like it's always. It's always the way it goes with me.
Hot dog
But
restaurants.
I'm now at the point where it's like, I have these good ideas. Do I change my goal, or do I, argue with myself to the point where it's like, tuck those good ideas aside, stop thinking about them because that's all you're thinking about right now. Realign yourself and your mental energy with the initial goal because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and focus on that. That's just a little dance that I'm doing.
Maybe you split it into two. Maybe you have like Shane's System Basic and Shane's System Expert. We could have like one released in a blue book and one released in a red book.
Maybe. There's so many complex systems out there. I don't know. There's a lot of simple systems too. I'm not that talented. I'm a smart dude, but I'm not that talented. What I don't want to do is try and compete with D&D and Pathfinder.
Wizards of the Coast and Paizo. Yeah.
Like, and a million other people now, especially with the OGL shit that went down earlier this year with Wizards really providing motivations for a lot of people to start building out their own systems. And
oh yeah,
I mean, I'd had this in my back pocket since well before then, but certainly
that
was a reminder of like, oh shit, dude, if you'd actually done some work and turn this into a thing by now, people might be looking for something new.
They might. Yeah. I mean,
but that's work.
Yeah, and I have so much Dungeons and Dragons crap just lying around. I would honestly like to go back and play second edition again. And going back to a little bit earlier as well, I wouldn't mind spinning up and trying fourth edition. I think because one of the problems that we had with fourth edition was there's just too much stuff to keep track of, right? Like you had 17 colored rings around the you couldn't
the pace is just
that's the thing though.
Skirmish with kobolds and it takes 17 hours.
If you had some assistance in keeping track of things, which is actually the next thing on the show notes, like having technology to aid in keeping track of that, like I think Roll20 could make that viable.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, well, we apply a condition here, and this is here, and okay, so this, and that add up to this, and roll the dice, and you add those things, and we're done. All right, next. We fourth edition actually for us, because we did mostly Theater of the Mind, turned out to be more of a card game than an actual tabletop role-playing game.
Like, how do you play that Theater of the Mind? Like, it is a system that is designed to be played on a grid.
Yeah, but you can do it. And it didn't turn out all that badly, honestly. It was just a question of like who's engaged with who, like who's in range. And, I play this card. Okay, what does it do? How does it affect everybody? Everybody keep track of your own shit. Part of the reason that fourth edition was a problem for a lot of people was that there was just too much stuff for the DM to keep track of. Like you just couldn't. Nobody has a brain that big. So if you can trust your players and they're keeping track of their own stuff, then generally it works out, and everybody forgets enough that it doesn't matter. And I come again back to my point that the system doesn't matter. What matters is the players win most of the time, because if the monsters win every time, then your game is real short. So as long as the players win. Here's an interesting thought, and this is one of those things where there have been a lot of times in like a big climactic fight that someone has made this sort of grand and heroic gesture or some kind of charge. It's the charge of the Light Brigade. It doesn't work, and then somebody throws a rock and the big bad guy dies because he had 1 hit point left. And there's an idea that's floating around out there that rather than keeping track of hit points, you just go, all right, what's the dramatically appropriate point for this monster to die?
Mm-hmm.
You don't even keep track of hit points. It's like, is that a good one? That's a good point for them to die. All right, yeah, it dies at that point. Now, there's a flip side to that, where if you tell your players that that's what's happening, then it's not going to work. Right. And I will admit to, like, I keep track of hit points, right? But if it's, hey, like the person who has the emotional connection to the death of this particular creature is next in order and this creature is at 0 hit points, well, now it's on its last legs.
Yeah.
Whatever they do, it's going to die.
Yeah. And the flip side of that is also like, if there isn't a significant emotional connection to whatever this is,
Yeah,
don't prolong the combat. Like,
exactly.
oh, you got 4 guys left on the map, and all of them have like 7 hit points left, and like the outcome is already being determined,
Yep.
and
They
now
fall
it's
over
just
dead.
making
Yeah.
numbers go down. Um,
Hmm.
all right, I want to get
Oh,
back to the technology aids things. So one thing I've never done, no, I can't say never. One thing I have not done in a very, very long time is DM, GM a game in any system in person.
well, you just need to come visit, bud.
The last time I did it, I was working off of cue cards and paper character sheets. Now I know that you have been a fairly avid user of D&D Beyond over the years. So
Yeah.
my first question for you is, how do you feel generally about those sorts of technology aids and minor automation tools when you're sitting around a table playing in person?
I don't mind them generally. It depends on how distracting they are, right? It very much depends, because sometimes, a lot of the times, I should say, those things are being accessed on someone's phone,
Mhm.
right? And if that person is engaged in the game and they're like, okay, my turn is coming up, I'm going to look through my character sheet and I'm going to, okay, so I'll click on that and make a note of that. And then when their turn comes, they push a button to roll some dice. I have no problem with it. If it's, oh, it's not my turn and I have my phone here, so I'm going to play, Angry Birds or, uh, you know, Snake or
Mhm.
whatever phone games the kids are playing these days, probably crypto or something. Then that's a problem, because it's, then it comes to their turn and they're like, oh, sorry, just let me finish this level. It's like, no, like, play one game at a time.
Mhm.
Uh, so the only problem that I have with distractions is the potential, and I'm guilty of this more than anyone else. I used to, at one time I actually used map tools as a DM, and I literally had my laptop. Everyone else was theater of the mind, but I had a map with just tokens on it so that I could tell where everyone was and who they were fighting. Um, and I would get distracted by, flashing lights and beeping noises. So, it's the kind of thing that we're very easily distracted by flashing lights and uh, intriguing noises.
Mhm.
So I think technology is wonderful. The idea when Microsoft Surface first came out, and it was like, hey, here's this sort of central coffee table type digital map in the middle of the table. I thought that was like, oh, this is the wave of the future. Like, this is, everybody's going to get in on this. And then it just flopped. So I think the idea of digital tools is fantastic. I don't think they've been implemented ideally yet.
Mhm. Now, just the obvious thing that I think of is that, having digital tools, it's less about the tools and more about the opportunity that having those tools and using them creates, and that you have people bringing devices to the table, right?
Hmm.
Actively have a phone or a tablet or something in front of them, and that's sort of the risk that I'm trying to weigh, because the thing with my system is that it's, man, I don't want to get into all the details because we were going to do this, and I could go on forever, but it's a classless system.
Hmm.
I have a very sort of simple sort of attribute setup where you've got some skills, then you've got some derivative skills that just sort of auto calculate. You get points as you progress, and you get to invest them how you'd like. So it works best when all of that stuff is automated. Like, you can create a character in my system in 2 minutes. You fill out a name, you go to uh, I'm calling it background right now, but it could be the equivalent to like for a system where races or what are not appropriate species or whatever. Maybe you've got some bonuses there, and then you've got here's, I'm level 1, I've got 8 of these points, and I could invest how I want to. Doop 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 doop. Starter item, you're good.
Mhm.
But the way that the numbers interact really lend themselves well to the automation. It's not complex math. Like you could sit with just a here's the rules outlining what the math are and paper and a pencil. And
Mhm.
it wouldn't take you that long, but it isn't as intuitive to be like, okay, well, in my Google sheet that is the basic prototype for this, like I'm using some floor functions, I'm rounding, you know,
Mhm.
by investing 2 points in this, it moves this up by one. And if you really want to know how it works, I mean, I've got like that all broken out, but it's just so simple to be like boop, 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 boop. I'm good to go. But that sort of necessitates having a device, a super basic character sheet. Like it's while you're playing, it's essentially a one pager. Like, there's like
Mhm.
8 things, and each of those you could kind of roll on just by clicking on them. Apply the different bonuses, and that's basically the system in a nutshell. That's sort of how you play, but you're going to have your phone in your hand doing it, and that's
Mhm.
what I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, I think that if the math is tedious enough, then your system isn't simple enough. Is what I come away with. Um, I don't know. I don't want to go
Like
poo poo.
I don't want to. Tedious is probably not, like I'm looking for quick and easy, right? Like the math needs to be the math. Like you could talk about D&D fifth edition. I would not call it tedious compared to a lot of other systems, but something as simple as like proficiency bonus and how that works as you level is. I mean, you
Yep.
could lay it out on a table, and that's one way of thinking about it. But the actual math behind it is just it's simple, but it's not super intuitive unless you're focused on the math at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's one of
and
those things is like the derivative part of things where it's like or the synergistic elements of things where it's like if you do this one of the things that and I read quite frequently the Dungeons and Dragons subreddits here, there, and everywhere. And one of the things that I see so often is people comparing damage numbers to each other, right? And what ends up happening is that some people, rather than playing Dungeons and Dragons, are playing Optimize My Character Sheet,
Mhm.
which is fine. If that's what you want to do and that's what your group does, great. Have fun, do your thing. But if you have 4 people around the table and 3 of them are playing Optimize My Character Sheet and one of them is playing I really want to go searching for the mythical pony with a horn on its head, there's going to be a little bit of conflict because, Little Miss Unicorn is not going to have a whole lot of fun with okay, so I say hello to the innkeeper while the other 3 are burning the inn down with their laser beams that are shooting out of their eyes. Um, but there's so much focus on, and I don't know if I don't think it's MMO influence, but you definitely see it in MMOs where it's. And I had conversations because EverQuest was originally sort of designed as a um, let's make a world big enough that it feels like Dungeons and Dragons, and at the time it did, right? Because nobody knew where anything was. People weren't doing a
Yes,
lot of sort of digital scraping.
thank you, mode
Um,
with graphics.
yeah, yeah, which is basically what it was. But like there were lots of things where like you would pick up some gear that was good for your warrior, right? And in EverQuest, warriors need armor class first, hit points second. Period. End of
Mhm.
discussion. But it would have intelligence on it. It would have wisdom on it because at that time you were playing a single character because it took so much time to invest into things that you didn't like level up another character in order to do your trade skilling stuff. This was the character you did trade skilling on. So you needed some of the other stats as well, because they also they hadn't released all of the math behind stuff.
Mhm.
So there was, they intentionally left things really vague. Like, does intelligence help with this? Does wisdom help with that? Does agility help with this? Is it dexterity? Is it strength? What is it? But now people complain about, well, they just didn't know how to itemize things. Well, no, they did that intentionally because they were expecting you to be a well-rounded character. Whereas now, and the people who are left, honestly, are quite hardcore gamers. So it's very much about maximizing whatever your maximum thing is, right? So if you're a wizard, it's maximizing your pew pew, and if you're a warrior, it's maxing your tank ability or
Mhm.
your tankiness or whatever it is. And I see a lot of that with systems in things like Dungeons and Dragons. And when you start building synergies into things, then that becomes a goal for some people. That it is right. Like, what I need to do is I need to figure out, if I do this and this, then that maximizes this, and then I trade off this for that. So what's your dump stat? Right. And I don't know if it's possible, but I really like the idea of, right, creating a system where everybody should be a little bit good at everything.
Mhm.
And the trick to that is that you have to give everybody something to do with
Mhm.
everything.
Mhm.
Because you could, I mean, like, hey, we're doing point buy. I have 8s in everything except strength, right? Or I have 8s in everything except intelligence. Look at how good a wizard I am. Are you though? Right?
Yeah,
Like,
I
you're
mean,
good,
typically
and
point buy has a cap just to avoid
to
that, but yeah.
right, but because you have to alleviate that, because there is nothing to
Yep.
incentivize you as a wizard to take charisma, because you're like, the party face will do it.
Right. And here's some parallels I would like to draw. I agree that that is a problem. It is especially a problem if all you do is engage in combat.
Yep.
The parallel that I want to draw is that one of the best things that I thought, just sort of a basic thinking about creating characters, the emphasis in fifth edition, the character sheet, is the idea of uh, traits, bonds, flaws.
Hmm.
Like anytime I have people create characters, I want to say, oh, think about flaws. Flaws are fun. Flaws are where a lot of story happens. Now, if you look at that sort of min maxing for combat approach and what's my dump stat, I mean, you're looking at min maxing. I'm looking at, here's a character with a flaw that I should be not forcing, but encouraging gameplay to shine a light on and allow them, encourage them to role play those numbers as flaws.
I'm okay with them being flaws. And
Like,
looking at it, that's a different perspective, and I appreciate it.
yeah.
But at the same time, I guess really what happens, like, everybody needs their sort of time to shine.
Mhm.
My concern is, have you watched? There's I know it's on YouTube. I'm not sure if it originated on YouTube. There's a video called "The Gamers," and then there's like "The Gamers 2: The Dorkening," I think is what it's called,
I want to
or
say I've heard of it, but I haven't watched it.
Dorkness Rising. In it, there's a rogue who rolls to steal somebody's pants, and of course, like, it highlights the ridiculousness of critical success. You steal his pants, and he doesn't notice, right? And they actually act it out, and he rips his pants off. But one of the things that they sort of highlight is that there's two guys. They want to have a game, and they don't have enough people, so there's two a dungeon master and two guys, and one of them knows a girl who might be interested in playing. So they invite her along to play. And of course, these two guys are like, well, this is the way that you do this. This is how you optimize this, that, and the other thing. And she's like a monk who has taken like most of her stats in intelligence. And they're like, oh, that's not going to work. And the sort of the joke about it is that she's actually read the rules, And intelligence gives you all kinds of synergies with a bunch of stuff, and she gets extra actions, she gets extra stuff, and blah blah blah. I guess like what I'm trying to get at is not that min-maxing is not necessarily evil. It's when the system lends itself to min-maxing the same way every time. Right? Like every warrior has 18 strength and 8 charisma. Which is not necessarily a problem on its own until, in order to be a viable warrior, you must do that. Right? If there's a way that I can go, all right, like I'm gonna put most of my points into charisma, and that should be playable.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
See, and I don't know. It depends on your players. It depends on your dungeon master. Like, to me, viability is something that's completely meaningless, because if my players are going to create suboptimal characters, I'm adjusting the difficulty curve of the
Sure.
encounters and situations I put them
But
in to account for that, and also like to put them in the difficult situations that are narratively interesting rather than, I don't
it
know.
I agree. It depends. It very much depends on players and the DM. I think the trouble comes not so much when you have like a party of suboptimal characters. I think that would be a lot of fun. There was one of the guys who was involved in the original writing of the Basic Expert Master BEC, whatever the BEMCI with the Immortals in it. I forget his name.
Mhm.
But I interacted with him on an internet forum for a bit, and he had some really sort of interesting points. He was running some games at a convention, and he ran one where everyone's stats were all 8s, and it was perfectly fine. And he ran another one where everyone's stats were all 18s, and it was perfectly fine. So like the stats not defining your character is fine. The trouble, I think, comes when you have like some of the players at your table who have gone all out on optimizing everything for combat, and other people who have made interesting characters who have flaws and have strengths and weaknesses, and the sort of contrast between those two. Right, where like I made a suboptimal character at one point in a thing that I was playing, and it just turned out to not be any fun, right? Because I had nothing to do. Like by the time my turn came around, everything was dead. I had nothing to do. And some of that is a DM balancing thing,
Mhm.
right? But some of it is also that like there has to be not balance in the way that most people look at it, but sort of balance in that all of your characters need to have something to do. And I think that there's an issue in a lot of modern systems where optimizing things becomes kind of a necessity because the difference between optimize and suboptimal is so big.
Mhm.
Right? If it was, hey, the difference between optimal and suboptimal is, a couple of points here and
Yeah.
there, a couple of failed rolls, it's fine.
Yeah, I don't know. I just I do have a little bit different perspective on it, just because and I'm using 5th edition as sort of my primary
Mm-hmm.
system here when considering like this. There's just not enough to like, if investing your resources in a particular thing to maximize your efficiency there, if that becomes a problem in gameplay, then that's not an optimization problem to me. That's you're focusing too much on one type of gameplay problem. Like you played a suboptimal character, but I'm willing to bet you were playing at a bit of a munchkin table, right?
A bit, yeah,
Yeah, so you're only doing combat.
pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, the role play has gotten or had gotten better over time, but or it had become more like there was definitely
Mhm.
more role play, but the main focus was definitely combat. And it becomes like, and again, it's a question of like, where do you balance that between what is the DM's responsibility to make gameplay fun for everyone, and what is the player's responsibility to make a character that makes sense for the play that you're going to do. And there's some, I think there's some give and take there, and I think there's a middle ground to be found.
Hmm.
I don't think that you can make a system that takes that out,
No, not at all.
but I would be interested in exploring the possibility of trying. And fifth edition actually did a bit of that. One of the things with the sort of bounded accuracy of fifth edition was an attempt to take care of that. Because playing, like I actually started playing Dungeons and Dragons with the red books. When
Hmm.
you will roll 3d6 in order. That's your character.
Hmm.
Now choose a class. And elf was a class when I started.
Hmm.
And it was unbalanced. It was janky. It was messy. And second edition fixed some of that, but there was still a really weird power curve where different classes
Hmm.
went up levels at different experience totals.
Yep.
And different classes got experience for doing different things. It was really weird. And one of the things that happened is that you ended up with like sort of fighters starting at level 1, reasonably powerful,
Hmm.
and they didn't get more powerful relative to other classes much at all. And wizards started off as basically useless,
Hmm.
but by level 8 or 10, they were gods.
Yep.
Fifth edition,
Yeah.
fourth edition fixed a lot of that. Fifth edition broke some of it again.
Hmm. What I will say is the gap between, like, if you look at power gaming,
Mm-hmm.
uh, from fifth edition relative to even 3.5 and Pathfinder, the gap is much, much wider in those older games. Like where you're
Yes.
playing, you're playing in a system that I admit encourages the power gaming, not just in how you're statting, but like, you're level 8 and you don't have at least 3 classes. You're doing it wrong. You're only rolling 17 dice per action. Like you're doing
Yeah.
it wrong, scrub. And I mean, that almost doesn't exist in fifth edition. I think there's some sort of
Oh man.
cheesy kind of combinations of things. Like,
Yeah.
I think of something like mixing of feats. There's some unique combinations that create some definite advantages. Polearm Mastery and Sentinel, for instance, is a good
Yes.
example of one. Where, I mean, maybe the DM and the player just needs to have a conversation up front and be like, "Oh, what are you doing, man? You know what you're doing." But even then, the gap between that and just a person playing regularly, not intentionally power gaming, is so much more narrow than some of those older systems. Like it's
It
it's
is.
it's still an issue. I don't want to pretend that it doesn't exist, but it is so
It's
much
better.
less of an issue. Like
It is.
it
Here's the thing is that where I'm coming at this from is not so much to say that the system is wrong.
Mhm.
It's that the idea is probably a flaw in how, not necessarily in how people are playing the game, but sometimes in how players interact with each other. Like
Well,
there's a lot of math nerds on the Dungeons and Dragons subreddits doing
oh
like, oh, you
sure.
got
Yeah.
if you're not doing 138 damage per round, you built your character wrong.
Right.
It's like 138 damage per round. Like, how is that? Oh wow. But so many people too are optimizing for level 20. It's like your campaign's not getting to level 20, bud.
Hmm.
Like, do
Yeah.
what's fun.
Right. And I guess that goes back to session 0, the social contract you create with your players, clearly
Yeah.
setting expectations for what this game is going to be. And I
Yes.
go back to your Munchkin group, like if the discussion happened where it's like, look, we're kicking down doors, we're killing some monsters, like this is what we're doing here.
Hmm.
Uh then you know what you're signing up for.
Yeah, the session 0 didn't really make that abundantly clear.
Yeah. Okay. Well then,
Well, the other thing is too is sometimes campaigns change, right? Like we
oh
started
sure.
off with like story driven stuff and light combat, and then moved into roll for initiative, basically.
And then maybe some conversations just need to happen between the DM and the players. Like, hey, you know what? The combat's fun, but I'd like to do some other stuff too.
Well, what I did was I just rolled a new character and said, my other character's not really interested in doing this anymore.
Yeah.
But this new guy's interested in signing on. So, anyway, I mean, it worked out okay. It was
Yeah.
generally amicable, right? It was just, I had an interesting idea. It was kind of a one note character. It was a sour note. Move on.
All right. Well, I think that's probably enough about that. I do have some other questions, but I'm not gonna waste a hell of a lot more time on them. Do you want to get into the pod bag?
Let's do that.
You've got mail.
This pod bag is actually going to more or less be an extended parting gift section. Ian writes in, I've listened to a lot of podcasts in the past 13 years. What are some lesser known podcasts that you enjoy that you feel should get more credit? This can span any topic of your choosing.
Well, my contribution is going to be really short
Okay.
because literally the only podcasts that I know about are ours and Chasing Scratch. I know that you've recommended a couple over the course of our time here and even before that outside of this place, but uh, I don't have a lot of time for podcasts.
So
I'd like to, I just don't have time.
you work at home.
I
Do
do.
you find listening to something that's not just background noise distracting when you're working?
Yes, I do. I'm concentrating a lot of times on various numbers and moving and sort of relating text that somebody wrote on a mimeograph in the 1940s to modern CAD software. So I'm often like transcribing things, but not exactly directly because
Mm.
things have changed, right? Not just physically, but also in the way that we actually write things down. So it's like I have to take this information, I have to present it in this way, but it has to be the same information,
Mhm.
except I have to change it for the things that have changed. It's a lot of stuff to keep track of. I do listen to an awful lot of music creators on YouTube who do like I listen to a lot of synthwave.
Yeah.
Back to the 80s.
Yeah, you kicked me a few like metal playlists that you said you were listening to a fair bit while you're working. And that's why I was asking the question about whether you can listen to podcasts while you're working. Like I know that
No.
sometimes it's a little hard to split your attention, and podcasts tend to be uh they come in different flavors. There's clearly background podcasts that's just noise, and then there's podcasts that's like, I want to pay attention to this.
And really, the only ones to talk about like the flavors of podcasts, the only ones that I would really be interested in paying attention to is something that I actually want to pay attention to.
Hmm.
Like if I'm not interested in listening to what you're talking about, why am I listening to you talking?
That's That's interesting because what you're describing is basically how I felt about podcasts when I first started listening to podcasts, like back in, I don't know, 2006, 2007, like when the word podcast was invented. And now I look at the podcasts that I listen to and like they've helped shape my interests. I've bent myself around some interesting creators and people that I just like hearing talk about things. And my perspective on them is completely different. But I used to think very much the same way you did. So I'll make a few recommendations for you as well as Ian then.
Please write them down. My memory is bad.
It's not like we're recording this for posterity's sake.
Oh, I can't watch myself back. Are you crazy?
Oh, dude, you
I listened to
can.
my voice. I listened to my voice like one time, and that thing that we did with the nerd fight is like I had to listen to myself a bunch of times, and I'm just like, oh, my
That
voice,
is
it's
an
just
interesting
wrong.
phenomenon.
Yeah,
So back to Ian's question. Some of the lesser known podcasts, I mean, lesser known's a funny thing, right? Because like I think of some of the podcasts that I listen to are some of the bigger podcasts in their genres, but they just happen to be genres that like unless you're true crime or like conspiracy clickbait, you're lesser known. You
Mm,
know,
it's
like
kind of
Dan
true.
Carlin's Hardcore History as an example is like one of the OG podcasts. And like his fans are some of the biggest fans of any podcast ever, but it's not mainstream appeal. It's probably the best podcast on the planet. I listen to a lot of stuff like that. I listen to a ton of hockey and like hockey analytics podcasts. I'm not going to recommend those guys here, but there are a few that I am going to call attention to. The first one is called Retronauts. I think you would like it, Telson. You have a penchant for reading lists of video games by year from Wikipedia.
No, I don't. Nobody can prove that. That content was lost.
It is a. I'm going to put a short of it actually up this
Oh
week.
no.
Um, it is a podcast that's like video game history, rotating guests. The two main hosts, at least from the past, I don't know, 15 years, Jeremy Parrish and Bob Mackey. I like them both. Sometimes they'll get into like really, really niche topics. Like they'll focus on a specific video game or a specific console or a specific event in video game history. And then they do like every year they'll do a through the decades type thing where it's like, okay, it's what is it, 20, what year is it now? 2023?
Something like that.
So at some point towards the end of the year, they'll look back at 2013, 2003, 1993, 83, and do a couple of shows based on that, talking about notable games and systems and stuff within those years. But often it's just like, hey, this is the Monkey Island 2 show. And, let's talk about
Oh, I
everything from
love Monkey Island.
the people involved in the game, like, the key stakeholders and the visionaries and the developers and the thought process and the inspirations. And, they're not long shows, but they're typically an hour and a half. And they're a lot of fun.
And there's
Um,
558 of them.
yeah, it's I mean, it's a professional podcast. Like it's a niche kind of thing. So I think this qualifies as lesser known, but in the retro gamer space, they're probably one of the better ones. Another podcast, this one's probably lesser well known, tabletop focused, Dungeon Master of None, Rob Guthrie and Matt Drewinski, I think it was his last name. Sort of a general interest podcast, D&D, tabletop RPGs, Pathfinder, etc. Lots of like dungeon master kind of advice approach. Couple of interesting guys. I kind of find them funny. This one's definitely for Ian. I know he was a fan of Hello Internet, which has been on hiatus for years and years now. But one of the guys from that show, CGP Grey, does another podcast called Cortex, which it isn't a replacement for Hello Internet, but it's about the closest thing we're going to get. It focuses on, it's different than anything I listen to. It focuses on like productivity, usually in the workplace and like productivity related technology. It's not sort of nerdy tech, like they're Apple fanboys and stuff like that, but they talk about things like getting organized and strategies for planning projects and things and efficiency and sort of your own personal workspace. And I don't know, it's different, but it's a fun show. It's called Cortex with CGP Grey and Mike Hurley.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is a feel good one. It's a show that didn't last long. It turned into a book. It's by one of my favorite internet/nerd personalities, John Green, fairly well-known author, young adult stuff. Not stuff that I'm into. Like I like him for his other stuff. He and his brother Hank have been involved in creating things like Crash Course and SciShow, Complexly, a lot of the sort of nerdier YouTube channels that achieved sort of the early success. But he's written books that have been turned into movies. Fault in Our Stars is probably the biggest name one. But he ran a podcast for a couple of years, just him talking, called The Anthropocene Reviewed, which, and I'll quote its description, reviews different facets of the human-centered planet on a 5-star scale. So think of Yelp, but for subjects ranging from like Canada geese to viral meningitis. It had a short run, but it eventually turned into a pretty damn good book. And it's one of those things that you can go back and listen to it if you're just trying to find and put yourself into it like a different headspace. It helps you find perspective. It's just one of those feel good podcasts, even if the material's a little bit darker or negative. It like just can't wait to listen to a show about viral meningitis, but you know, Icelandic hot dogs, like it really does talk about it all, and it's a very sort of poetic kind of. It's actually a lot like what we did with our nerd fights thing. Like you can tell that he sat and he wrote something, and he wrote it to be quasi poetic. Now it doesn't have a theme the same way our thing did, but like he chooses his words carefully, and it comes across. The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green.
Speaking of nerd fights, the nerd fight currently stands at 1 vote to 1. And I would like to point out that my wife voted and Shane's wife did not vote.
And she listened to both of our videos. She's in one of the videos. I think she liked them. She was smiling and she just didn't push the button. Honey, I love you. I know you're listening. Push the button. Push the Whopper button.
Oh, yes. Push the Whopper button. We got bagels. Woo! Oh, man. I miss motivational speakers. They were so bonkers.
We'll give it another week. We'll harass some people to do some voting, and then we'll declare a winner.
Yeah.
Then we'll move on to the next one. Hey, I got one more parting gift, and then we'll wrap up this show.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Anybody want a peanut?
In addition to all of these wonderful podcasts, I want to recommend a YouTube channel that Ian actually recommended to me a couple years back. It's called Let's Game It Out. It originally started with 2 guys, and then it just became one main guy, Josh. And it is legit one of the funniest gaming YouTube channels on the internet. It's a guy that, I mean, he's found a formula for success. So I find his newer material just is playing the hits. So I actually don't like it as much as some of his older stuff, but it's still great. He just plays games wrong. Like he'll play indie games in early access and he'll find the ways to break them. He turns a cooking simulator into like a vile experience of existential dread. Like it is legit the funniest shit you will ever see. And he's just one of those personalities that's like, man, I wish I could be this cool. Like just naturally oozing charisma. Fuck that guy, Josh. You're amazing. I wish I were you. Let's game it out. Check it out.
Okay, back it up. There's a cooking simulator?
Oh, dude, there's like a cooking simulator franchise. I think he's played about 4 or 5 of the games, the cooking simulator games. There's a simulator game for everything.
Oh, it takes me back. You remember in the bad old DOS days, I actually had a surgery simulator where you had to like move the mouse to make incisions. And you had to, I learned that apparently there's like 7 different cuts you have to do to take an appendix out. I imagine they do it with like lasers and robots now, but it was like, this one goes like this, and then that one goes like that, and then this one goes like that. And I never got it right. I never actually got somebody's appendix out. I always killed the person on the table. But anyway, I'm not a surgeon, so it's fine.
You have homework tonight. Let's game it out. You're going to have to check it out.
Okay. Let me make a note.
Hey, that's our show. We would love to hear from you. If you have any listener submitted parting gifts, you'd like to ask us a question in the pod bag, hit us up by email. nerdingundertheinfluence. podbag@nerdingundertheinfluence.com. That's our email address.
Is it?
Did I mention I'm drinking a porter and it's like 8%? So
has anyone ever actually sent us an email who isn't Ian?
We get spam, a lot of
Awesome.
spam, but it's like podcast spam. It's like, hey, I love your show. Want to take it up to the next level? Yeah, we get all kinds of that. It's great.
Yeah, let's take it to the next level. Let's get 30 listeners.
The email address is like published as part of the RSS feed. So, yeah, like, hot ads. I think we even had I have to dig through it again, but somebody offered to buy the show.
Oh, cool. How much do they want to pay for it?
Oh, I'm sure they didn't want to pay anything.
They just wanted us to click something.
I'm quite certain that was the case. Anyway, hey, you could be the lucky one to be the first real person to contact us. Give us an email.
Like, comment, subscribe.
Yeah,
we're on the road to 1 million subscribers.
Here's your homework, valued listener. Recommend to Telson what he should do with the rest of his vodka.
Oh. Oh, I can't wait. I really, really hope we get some responses on that.
If we get some good responses, here's the deal. Won't be the next show because we're actually going to record the next show like right after this. But like when we record next, you'll have to make those drinks and try them.
Okay. I'm not inserting anything in any orifices of my body where vodka is not designed to go. Just so you know.
Oh, come on. Have a little fun.
Nope. Not after that one time in college when I really needed the money.